In a whirlwind of developments shaping the intersection of politics, media, and the digital economy, the past 24 hours have underscored the far-reaching influence of the current administration, from unprecedented media settlements to contentious legislative battles and the ever-present threat of cyber warfare. As July 2, 2025 draws to a close, a series of events has painted a vivid picture of a landscape where corporate interests, governmental power, and public discourse are inextricably linked. Perhaps the most striking news came late Tuesday, with Paramount Global agreeing to pay President Trump an extraordinary $16 million to settle his lawsuit over its 60 Minutes interview featuring former Vice President Kamala Harris. The president had sought a staggering $10 billion, alleging deceptive editing intended to interfere with the election. While many legal experts had dismissed the suit as baseless, citing First Amendment protections for publishers, Paramount's concession is seen as a significant victory for the president's strategy of pressuring major American institutions. The settlement includes Mr. Trump's legal fees, with the remaining funds earmarked for his future presidential library, and critically, a commitment from Paramount to release written transcripts of future 60 Minutes interviews with presidential candidates. This move, however, did not include an apology. Behind Paramount's decision was a clear corporate imperative. Chair Sherry Redstone reportedly favored a settlement, with company executives viewing the lawsuit as a potential impediment to the multi-billion-dollar sale of Paramount to Skydance, a deal that requires the Trump administration's approval. This commercial pressure has sent ripples through the media giant, leading to turmoil within CBS News, including the resignations of 60 Minutes executive producer Bill Owens and CBS News president Wendy McMahon, both citing an inability to make independent journalistic decisions. Veteran correspondent Scott Pelley had warned that any settlement would be very damaging to CBS, to Paramount, to the reputation of those companies, highlighting the deep concerns within the newsroom about the long-term credibility of a network famed for its investigative journalism and historical stands against political pressure. The settlement's size, identical to a $16 million defamation payout from ABC News to Mr. Trump in December, also raised alarm bells among lawmakers like Senators Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, who suggested it could be construed as a bribe, a perception that vexed Paramount's board members, weighing corporate benefits against accusations of securing an unrelated merger. Simultaneously, Washington, D.C. has been gripped by the high-stakes legislative drama surrounding President Trump's signature One Big Beautiful Bill, a comprehensive policy and budget document currently facing a tight vote in the House of Representatives. Despite a narrow 220 to 212 Republican majority, House Speaker Mike Johnson is scrambling to secure enough votes, with the president pushing for its passage by the July 4th Independence Day holiday. The bill, which the Senate narrowly approved after significant changes, faces staunch opposition from within Trump's own Republican Party, where fiscal conservatives voice concerns about the trillions it is projected to add to the national debt, while moderates decry proposed cuts to crucial social safety net programs like Medicaid and SNAP. Advocacy groups such as One Fair Wage argue that the bill's touted tax benefits for tipped workers would not offset the loss of vital services for the majority of restaurant employees who disproportionately rely on these programs. Amidst this legislative tug-of-war, a wave of misinformation has swept social media, with false claims circulating that the bill would grant the president power to cancel elections. White House spokeswoman Abigail Jackson quickly dismissed these as obviously fake news, and legal experts confirmed that such a provision would require a constitutional amendment, unequivocally stating the bill contains no such power. The episode underscores the pervasive challenge of disinformation in the digital age, even around critical legislative processes. Adding to the complex web of events, Columbia University disclosed a politically motivated cyberattack last week, where a hacktivist breached its data systems, stealing troves of student documents and causing widespread network outages. The attack, which also saw images of President Trump's smiling face appear on public monitors, highlights the increasing weaponization of cyber activities for political ends. While the university declined to elaborate on the hackers' specific motivations, the incident comes as Columbia remains under scrutiny from the Trump administration, which has threatened to pull $400 million in federal funding over alleged failures to protect Jewish students. Negotiations are ongoing, with the university already agreeing to several changes demanded by the administration, including new supervision for its Middle East Studies department and an overhaul of protest rules. This cyber incident further complicates an already fraught relationship between academic institutions and the federal government, particularly concerning issues of free speech, campus safety, and data security. Beyond these immediate headlines, the administration's influence continues to ripple through the economic and regulatory spheres. President Trump announced a new trade deal with Vietnam, dramatically increasing import duties on goods to 20% and up to 40% for transshipments in exchange for Vietnam opening its entire market duty-free to U.S. goods. This move directly impacts major tech firms like Apple, Google, Meta, and Samsung, which heavily source devices from Vietnam, potentially reshaping global supply chains. Concurrently, the president renewed his calls for Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell to resign, urging swift interest rate cuts despite the Fed's cautious stance on inflation. Furthermore, the administration has sought Supreme Court approval to fire Consumer Product Safety Commission members, continuing a pattern of challenging established removal protections for independent federal agencies, a move that could significantly alter the regulatory environment for consumer technology products. The administration is also withholding over $6 billion in federal grants for after-school and summer programs, citing a review to align grants with presidential priorities impacting low-income families nationwide. As the dust settles on a day marked by high-stakes negotiations, legislative gridlock, and the ever-present shadow of political influence, the intertwining narratives reveal a dynamic period where media independence, corporate strategy, government policy, and technological vulnerabilities are all under intense pressure. The coming weeks will undoubtedly see continued scrutiny of the Paramount settlement's implications for journalistic integrity, the fate of the One Big Beautiful Bill and its economic consequences, and the ongoing battle for digital security and academic autonomy. These developments collectively signal a future where the lines between political power and the broader technological and media ecosystem will likely continue to blur, demanding vigilant observation from all corners of society. The global economic stage is currently a maelstrom of high-stakes trade negotiations and ambitious domestic policy reforms, all converging around critical deadlines and the ever-present influence of presidential directives. As a self-imposed July 9 deadline for tariff adjustments looms, President Trump's administration is pushing aggressively for new trade pacts while simultaneously navigating the contentious passage of a sprawling budget bill through Congress. Each move poised to reshape the economic landscape for businesses and consumers alike. In a significant development on the trade front, President Trump announced a new deal with Vietnam, a pivotal Southeast Asian manufacturing hub that has become the U.S.'s 10th largest trade partner and 7th largest source of imports, sending over $130 billion in goods last year. Under the new agreement, Vietnamese goods entering the U.S. will face a 20% tariff, a notable reduction from the 46% Liberation Day duties initially proposed by Trump, but still higher than the current blanket 10%. Crucially, the deal also imposes a higher 40% tariff on any transshipped goods items routed through Vietnam but originating from other countries, particularly China, a measure aimed at curbing tariff circumvention. In return, Vietnam has agreed to eliminate tariffs on U.S. goods, effectively opening their market to the United States and lowering trade barriers. With the president suggesting opportunities for U.S. automakers to introduce more SUVs. This pact marks the second such deal since the Liberation Day duties were paused following an earlier agreement with the United Kingdom, and comes alongside a framework agreement with China to move towards a larger trade deal. However, not all negotiations are proceeding smoothly as the July 9 deadline approaches. Talks with Japan have reportedly soured, with President Trump threatening even higher tariffs, potentially reaching 30% or 35% on Japanese goods, exceeding the 24% Liberation Day level. Trump described Japan as very tough and very spoiled, stating, "I'm not sure we're going to make a deal. I doubt it with Japan." This stark warning, which experts like Kurt Tong, a former senior U.S. diplomat, suggest could lead to a higher punitive actions and Japanese countermeasures, underscores the administration's hardline approach. Despite these threats, Japanese automakers like Toyota have shown surprising resilience in U.S. sales, partly due to their local production capabilities mitigating some of the tariff impact. Meanwhile, Japan's Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba has openly questioned the market for large left-hand drive U.S. cars in Japan, indicating ongoing friction. Elsewhere, the European Union has signaled a willingness to accept a universal 10% tariff on many exports to the U.S. but is staunchly seeking exemptions for key sectors including pharmaceuticals, alcohol, semiconductors and commercial aircraft, with EU Trade Commissioner Maros Sefcovic instructed to take a tougher line in Washington. On the North American front, a major sticking point with Canada was resolved as Ottawa scrapped its planned digital services tax targeting large U.S. technology companies, leading to an immediate resumption of stalled trade talks. India too is on track to seal an interim trade agreement with the U.S., a step towards a comprehensive bilateral accord. These varied outcomes highlight the administration's strategy of pursuing smaller phased deals to avoid the reimposition of severe tariffs, using the threat of higher duties as leverage. The broader economic reverberations of these tariff policies are already being felt across sectors. The J.P. Morgan Institute estimates that President Trump's current tariff plans could impose direct costs of $82.3 billion on a key group of U.S. employers, potentially leading to price hikes, layoffs, hiring freezes, and reduced profit margins. Companies are grappling with these new realities. Electric vehicle maker Rivian reported a 22% fall in quarterly deliveries, attributing it partly to tariff-driven economic uncertainty. Even large apparel makers like Nike, which manufactures significantly in Vietnam, anticipate a potential $1 billion tariff hit to profits this year, though they plan to offset it by increasing prices. Smaller businesses such as Pluffle, a human dog bed manufacturer, have been forced to explore domestic production after a 145% tariff on Chinese imports made their original model unsustainable. Consumers are also feeling the pinch, with prices on China-made goods on Amazon rising faster than overall inflation. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell explicitly stated that tariffs have influenced the central bank's monetary policy, noting that all inflation forecasts for the United States went up materially as a consequence of the tariffs, and suggesting the Fed would likely have cut rates more aggressively without them. Globally, Asian stocks are bracing for a challenging summer as tariff pressures dampen sentiment, and Italy's main industry lobby warns of a potential $23.6 billion loss in exports and 118,000 jobs if the U.S. imposes a 10% tariff. Despite these economic headwinds, tariff revenue for the U.S. government is on pace for another monthly record in June, a point President Trump frequently highlights. Concurrently with these international trade machinations, the domestic economic landscape is undergoing significant shifts, with the contentious One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which narrowly passed the Senate and is now headed to the House for final approval. This sprawling budget bill, estimated by the Congressional Budget Office to add $3.3 trillion to federal deficits over the next decade and potentially leave millions without health coverage, has ignited fierce disputes even within Republican ranks. Key provisions include making the 2017 Trump tax cuts permanent and increasing standard deductions, while also introducing stricter requirements for social programs. For Medicaid, the bill proposes new work requirements for childless adults and able-bodied adults with children aged 15 and over, requiring 80 hours of work or volunteering per month, along with more frequent re-enrollment and additional income verifications. The Senate's version of these Medicaid changes is particularly stringent, raising concerns that nearly 12 million Americans could lose health coverage. Other notable items in the bill include an increase in the state and local tax SALT deduction limit from $10,000 to $40,000 for 5 years, and reforms to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program (SNAP) that would require states with high error rates to contribute more to funding. A no tax on tips provision, a campaign promise by Trump, is also included, allowing deductions for tip wages and overtime, though these benefits would phase out based on income. The Senate bill also proposes a permanent increase to the child tax credit and raises the debt ceiling by $5 trillion. A point of contention between House and Senate Republicans lies in clean energy tax cuts. While both chambers seek to end Biden-era credits, the Senate proposes a slower phase-out for businesses building wind and solar farms. with both versions denying credits to companies with supply chain ties to foreign entities of concern like China. House Republicans, particularly hardliners, have voiced strong opposition to the Senate's version, citing concerns over increased national debt and insufficient cuts to clean energy tax breaks. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries has lambasted the bill as a reckless, regressive, and reprehensible GOP tax scam, vowing to use it against Republicans in upcoming elections. Despite the internal divisions, President Trump has urged House Republicans to unite and pass the bill swiftly, aiming for completion before the July 4th recess. As the U.S. navigates these complex trade and fiscal policies, the coming weeks will be critical. The July 9th tariff deadline will undoubtedly force more countries to either accept new terms or face heightened duties, impacting global supply chains and consumer prices. Domestically, the fate of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act in the House will determine the trajectory of tax policy, social programs, and the national debt for years to come. The interplay between these external pressures and internal legislative battles will continue to define the current economic landscape, underscoring a period of significant uncertainty and strategic maneuvering on both the international and domestic fronts. Washington, D.C. finds itself in a familiar yet intensely high-stakes political maelstrom as the Trump administration's sweeping domestic policy bill, dubbed the Big Beautiful Bill, navigates its treacherous path through the House of Representatives. Fresh off a narrow Senate victory, the legislation now faces an uncertain future mired in procedural delays and deep divisions within the Republican Party. Even as President Trump himself employs a blend of charm and pressure to muscle it across the finish line before a self-imposed July 4th deadline. The bill, a cornerstone of President Trump's domestic agenda, aims to drastically slash taxes and significantly cut the federal safety net. Its passage through the Senate on Tuesday, though narrow, was a critical step, but the House version faces substantial changes that have alienated a vocal bloc of conservative Republicans. Speaker Mike Johnson, grappling with a razor-thin majority, can afford only a handful of defections, turning every procedural vote into a protracted battle. On Wednesday, a single procedural vote remained open for over 5 hours as Republican leaders desperately tried to sway holdouts, a testament to the profound internal rifts. Representative Joe Negus, a Democrat from Colorado, even questioned the procedural allowance for such an extended vote, highlighting the unusual nature of the legislative standoff. At the heart of the House stalemate are the fiscal hawks, particularly members of the House Freedom Caucus, who are incensed by the Senate's modifications. These changes, made to secure broader support in the upper chamber, include adding at least another $1 trillion in spending, bringing the bill's total impact to an estimated $3.3 trillion added to the federal debt, and a $50 billion fund for rural hospitals. Provisions that would have immediately ended clean energy programs and restricted Trump accounts' tax-advantaged investment accounts for newborns to only U.S. citizens' children were also softened or removed. Representative Chip Roy of Texas, an ultra-conservative, vociferously criticized the Senate's version, calling it a deal killer of an already bad deal, and lamenting that the Senate doesn't get to be the final say on everything. Despite having voted for the House's earlier mediocre but passable product, Roy and others are now dug in, demanding further negotiations. To overcome this formidable opposition, President Trump has launched an aggressive charm offensive, a tactic that has historically proven effective. Lawmakers like Representative Tim Burchett of Tennessee, a hardline conservative, emerged from White House meetings seemingly transformed, gushing about the president's wonderful, informative, funny demeanor and the souvenirs, including signed placards with his name corrected, they received. As one White House official noted, Trump's consistent line to wobbly Republicans is, "Don't give the Democrats a win. Don't play into their hands." Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina attested to Trump's hospitality, describing invitations to golf or dine at his clubs. This blend of personal flattery and the implicit threat of social media thunderbolts, a fear underscored by Senator Thom Tillis's decision not to seek re-election after a Trump broadside, makes the president an unparalleled closer in the business, as Representative Dusty Johnson of South Dakota observed. However, the Democrats remain unified in their fierce opposition, seizing the opportunity to rally against what House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries of New York labeled this one big ugly bill. They argue it represents a moral failure, a cruel piece of legislation that would dismantle the social safety net, including Medicaid and nutrition assistance, while primarily benefiting the affluent through tax cuts. Democrats view the bill as a backdoor attempt to undo progress made by the Affordable Care Act and are strategically using procedural maneuvers like extended floor debates and proposed amendments to delay and attack the legislation, hoping to expose its perceived flaws to the American public ahead of next year's elections. Beyond the heated congressional debate, the Trump administration is navigating a complex array of other policy challenges and triumphs. On the immigration front, a federal judge in Washington delivered a significant blow by ruling that the administration cannot categorically deny asylum claims from individuals crossing the southern border. The Judge Randolph D. Moss cited the Constitution and existing federal immigration law, though he delayed the ruling's effect for 2 weeks to allow for an appeal, signaling a likely battle up to the Supreme Court. This ruling comes amidst a dramatic drop in illegal border crossings, with Border Patrol agents making just over 6,000 arrests in June, the lowest levels in decades. Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem declared it the most secure border in American history, attributing the success to Trump's hardline deterrence policies. Yet these policies have drawn sharp criticism from immigrant advocates who warn of disastrous effects for those seeking protection, with options for legal entry severely curtailed and fears of detention in facilities like Guantanamo Bay rising. Meanwhile, President Trump has also floated vague proposals to allow some undocumented farm and hospitality workers to remain in the country, acknowledging their necessity for American businesses, a move that has created confusion and internal divisions within his administration. In other developments, President Trump continued his public pressure campaign on the Federal Reserve, calling for Chairman Jerome H. Powell to resign immediately over the Fed's stance on interest rates, despite a recent Supreme Court signal that he may not have the power to remove Powell before his term expires in 2026. Internationally, the Pentagon offered a new yet still evolving assessment of the bombing campaign against Iran's nuclear program, stating it set back Tehran's capabilities by 1 to 2 years, a more cautious estimate than Trump's initial claim of obliterated. This shifting narrative comes as Iran reportedly moved to suspend cooperation with the UN nuclear watchdog. Furthermore, the administration has withheld over $6 billion in federal grants for after-school and summer programs, citing a review to align funding with presidential priorities, drawing warnings from providers about the impact on low-income families. As the big beautiful bill teeters on the brink, its fate hinges on President Trump's ability to unite his fractured party and Speaker Johnson's capacity to navigate the procedural minefield. The outcome will not only define the scope of the administration's domestic policy achievements, but also set the stage for future legislative battles and the ongoing public debate over the nation's fiscal health and social safety net. The coming days will reveal whether the president's charm offensive can once again overcome deep-seated ideological divides, or if this legislative cornerstone will be delayed, potentially forcing a cumbersome back-and-forth between chambers or even dying at the close of Congress. Regardless, the current legislative gridlock and the broader policy shifts underscore a period of profound reordering in American governance, with far-reaching implications for its economy, social fabric, and global standing. As a pivotal July 9 deadline looms, the global economic landscape is gripped by a complex interplay of ambitious trade policies and significant domestic fiscal strategies. The Trump administration's Liberation Day tariffs, initially paused, now threaten to snap back to higher levels for numerous trading partners, while simultaneously a push for sweeping tax cuts aims to reignite economic growth. This dual approach, marked by both aggressive protectionism and supply-side stimulus, is generating substantial debate and tangible impacts across industries and national economies. A recent analysis by the J.P. Morgan Institute, highlighted by PBS, starkly illustrates the potential burden of the proposed tariffs, estimating a direct cost of $82.3 billion for U.S. employers. Such an immense financial hit could cascade through the economy, potentially triggering price hikes, layoffs, hiring freezes, and diminished profit margins. Companies are already feeling the pinch. Electric vehicle maker Rivian reported a 22% fall in second quarter deliveries, attributing the decline partly to tariff-driven economic uncertainty. Even smaller businesses are not immune, as evidenced by Pluffle, a human dog bed manufacturer which saw its import costs from China skyrocket by 145%, forcing a painful shift to domestic production at a higher price point. The ripple effect extends globally, with Italy's main industry lobby warning of a potential $23.6 billion loss in exports and 118,000 jobs if the US imposes a blanket 10% tariff. Asian stock markets are also bracing for impact, with tariff pressures dampening investor sentiment. Amidst this backdrop of trade tensions, the administration has been actively negotiating, albeit with mixed results, to avert the full force of the July 9 tariff resumption. President Trump announced a preliminary trade deal with Vietnam, setting a 20% tariff on Vietnamese goods and a 40% rate on transshipment goods routed through Vietnam from other countries like China, significantly lower than the 46% Liberation Day rate but higher than the previous 10%. In return, Vietnam has agreed to zero tariffs on U.S. goods and promises to open its markets. This follows a pact with the United Kingdom and a framework agreement with China, both aimed at reducing existing levies and fostering broader trade deals. However, negotiations with Japan have reportedly soured, with President Trump threatening even higher tariffs, up to 30 to 35% beyond the initial 24% Liberation Day level, citing Japan's spoiled stance and reluctance to import U.S. rice. The European Union, while signaling a willingness to accept a 10% universal tariff, is pushing for crucial exemptions for sectors like pharmaceuticals, alcohol, semiconductors, and commercial aircraft, highlighting the complexity of reaching comprehensive agreements. The administration's earlier ambition of 90 deals in 90 days has clearly fallen short, with officials now focusing on smaller, phased agreements to avoid the harshest tariffs. In a contrasting economic narrative, the Trump administration, particularly its Council of Economic Advisers (CEA), and figures like Kevin Hassett and Stephen Miron, are championing a new round of tax cuts dubbed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. They argue that these cuts, building on the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act (TCJA) of 2017, will unleash a fresh wave of economic growth. The 2017 TCJA, they contend, led to a remarkable $6,400 increase in real median incomes within 2 years, outperforming initial CEA estimates of $4,000. Looking ahead, the current CEA projects that the new bill could drive an investment surge of up to 14.5%, pushing real median incomes up by an additional $10,000 relative to a scenario where the TCJA expires. This perspective directly challenges criticisms of fiscal irresponsibility, arguing that the resulting economic growth will generate sufficient additional revenue to offset the estimated $3.3 trillion to $3.7 trillion cost over 10 years. Hassett and Miron assert that if growth rises to 3% compared to the CBO's 1.8% estimate, revenue could increase by $4 trillion over the next decade, more than covering the bill's projected cost. They also point to the 2017 to 2024 period, where federal revenue relative to GDP remained stable at 17.1% despite corporate tax rate reductions, attributing deficit increases primarily to higher spending rather than tax cuts. The administration also posits that tariff revenues will play a role in offsetting the tax cuts costs, with the CBO estimating current tariff policies could raise $2.8 trillion over the next decade. Furthermore, they counter inflation concerns by arguing that increased domestic production spurred by investment from tax cuts would boost supply and thus drive down prices, contrasting it with what they describe as the Biden administration's spending and regulations that impeded supply. The plan also includes measures to stimulate labor force participation, such as no tax on tips and overtime and new tax credits on Social Security benefits, aiming to address potential worker shortages in a fast-growing economy. This intricate web of policy decisions has not gone unnoticed by the Federal Reserve. Chairman Jerome Powell recently indicated that the central bank likely would have cut rates if not for tariffs, noting that tariffs significantly influenced inflation forecasts. This highlights the complex balancing act faced by policymakers where fiscal stimulus and trade protectionism create unique challenges for monetary policy. While U.S. manufacturing has shown weakness and input costs have risen due to tariffs, some companies like Nike are strategizing to offset these costs by raising consumer prices. Testing the limits of consumer demand. As the July 9 deadline looms large, the coming weeks will undoubtedly offer a clearer picture of the immediate economic fallout from these high-stakes decisions. The long-term implications, however, will depend on whether the administration's confidence in growth-spurring tax cuts can indeed counteract the friction and costs imposed by its aggressive tariff strategy, shaping everything from corporate balance sheets to the everyday American's wallet. The world watches keenly as this grand economic experiment continues to unfold. In a day marked by a series of significant announcements, the Trump administration on Wednesday unveiled a sweeping recalibration of U.S. defense policy and spending, signaling a profound shift in national priorities from global arms distribution to domestic security, all while navigating an unprecedented budget landscape. These developments underscore a complex interplay of fiscal ambition, strategic reevaluation, and contentious reallocations that promise to reshape America's military posture for years to come. At the heart of the day's news was the Pentagon's formal announcement of a staggering $1.01 trillion defense budget proposal for fiscal year 2026, marking the country's first-ever trillion-dollar defense request and eclipsing the previous year's total by over $100 billion. This monumental figure comes despite earlier promises from President Donald Trump of hundreds of billions of dollars of fraud and abuse to be uncovered within the Defense Department, a pledge made in collaboration with Elon Musk through the DOGE initiative. The actual savings from DOGE collaboration touted in the budget rollout amounted to a mere $6 billion, a stark contrast to the initial grand claims. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, in testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee, argued the budget was crucial to end 4 years of chronic underinvestment in our military. This defense spending surge stands in sharp relief against the administration's broader fiscal strategy, which includes a reconciliation megabill that passed the Senate and is set to cut $1 trillion from Medicaid, $300 billion from food stamps, and hundreds of billions more from clean energy, foreign aid, and education programs. House Armed Services Committee Chair Mike Rogers, Republican Alabama, defended the defense boost as needed to restore American deterrence, revitalize the defense industrial base, and modernize our military. However, critics like former Trump chief strategist Steve Bannon and defense spending expert William Hartung of the Quincy Institute expressed frustration with Bannon noting the crickets from the Pentagon regarding waste, and Hartung lamenting the rushed budget rollout's omission of key documents, making analysis very hard. Amidst this ambitious spending plan, the Pentagon also confirmed a global review of U.S. weapons shipments, with Chief Spokesman Sean Parnell explaining the creation of a framework to analyze what munitions we're sending where to help the President and Secretary of Defense make decisions. This review has notably led to a pause in the delivery of some air defense interceptors and precision-guided munitions to Ukraine. Pentagon officials cited concerns over dwindling U.S. weapons stocks as a driving factor, a concern not new to the current administration but now explicitly impacting active military aid. Parnell articulated the administration's America First stance, stating, "We can't give weapons to everybody all around the world. We have to look out for America and defending our homeland and our troops around the world." This decision comes at a particularly perilous moment for Ukraine, whose efforts against Russia have heavily relied on American ordnance. And just a week after President Trump had indicated openness to selling more weapons to Kyiv. Domestically, the Department of Defense is expanding its role at the southern border, establishing national defense areas. Texas Agriculture Commissioner Sid Miller voiced strong support for this move, citing the daily threats from illegal crossings, drug cartels, and human traffickers who damage property, steal resources, and endanger lives. Miller emphasized that this issue extends beyond Texas, posing a national security threat affecting our food supply and rural economies, and applauded President Trump's executive order to reinforce the military's role in border security. This represents a significant deployment of military resources to address internal security concerns, reflecting a broader reorientation of defense priorities, adding another layer of controversy to the unfolding narrative. A substantial budget surplus from the Sentinel intercontinental ballistic missile ICBM program, which has faced enormous cost overruns and was declared in critical breach of the Nunn-McCurdy law, is being controversially reallocated. Instead of being returned to the Treasury or used to replenish the very munitions paused for Ukraine or even to offset the drastic cuts in domestic programs, at least $400 million of these excess funds are earmarked for converting a luxury 747-passenger plane, a gift from the Qatari Emir, into the next variant of Air Force One. Expert estimates suggest the full conversion could cost closer to $1 billion. This decision has drawn sharp criticism, with observers questioning the fiscal prudence and strategic rationale, especially given the Sentinel program's own troubled history, with its estimated cost for building 634 missiles having doubled to $141 billion, not including maintenance or warheads. The broader nuclear modernization campaign, including Trump's Golden Dome missile defense initiative, is slated to receive approximately $85 billion in the proposed budget. This includes significant funding for the U.S. nuclear triad, with the Sentinel ICBM slated to replace the Minuteman III missiles, facing an estimated cost ballooning to $170 billion after the realization that new missiles could not use legacy silos. The National Nuclear Security Administration and NSA, responsible for nuclear warhead production, is also in line for a nearly 30% boost in its Weapons Activities Division, despite struggling to meet timelines and cost goals for re-establishing plutonium pit production. Government watchdogs have consistently highlighted staffing problems as an Achilles heel for the NNSA, exacerbated by DOGE-created vacancies and a near-total hiring freeze, yet the fiscal 2026 budget request does not include significant funding for additional federal employees. As William Hartung put it, this NNSA funding boost is a recipe for wasting money. While former Democratic Representative John Tierney criticized the lack of strategic thought in defense spending, often influenced by congressional district interests rather than national strategy. This confluence of an unprecedented defense budget, a strategic re-evaluation of global military aid, a heightened domestic military presence, and controversial spending reallocations paints a vivid picture of the Trump administration's evolving defense priorities. The coming months will undoubtedly see intense congressional deliberation over the Big Beautiful Bill and the broader defense budget, as lawmakers and the public grapple with the implications of these monumental shifts for national security, global alliances, and the very fabric of American society. The debate over how America defends itself and at what cost is far from over. In an increasingly complex geopolitical landscape where traditional diplomacy grapples with the rapid currents of digital influence. Recent developments in the Middle East underscore a delicate balance between high-stakes negotiations and the evolving nature of public perception. As efforts intensify to secure a fragile ceasefire in Gaza, a new peculiar form of digital content dubbed diaper diplomacy has emerged, showcasing how artificial intelligence is reshaping political discourse in unexpected ways. The diplomatic spotlight this week shines brightly on the U.S.-led push to broker a truce between Israel and Hamas. On Wednesday, Israeli Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar expressed cautious optimism, citing positive signs in the long-stalled ceasefire negotiations. Speaking from Estonia, Mr. Sa'ar underscored Israel's eagerness for proximity talks to resume as soon as possible, a sentiment echoed by President Trump, who stated on Tuesday that Israel had agreed to conditions to finalize a 60-day ceasefire. The proposed deal, as detailed by an Israeli defense official and a Palestinian source close to Hamas, involves the release of 10 living hostages and the return of 18 bodies held by Hamas in Gaza in exchange for an unspecified number of Palestinian prisoners. This exchange would be staggered over the 60-day period, a significant shift from a May U.S. proposal that sought the release of all captives within 7 days. Notably, Hamas would also reportedly refrain from the controversial televised handover ceremonies that drew international criticism during previous truces. This renewed momentum comes ahead of a planned meeting between Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and President Trump in Washington next week and follows a recent decision by the United States to join Israel in bombing Iranian nuclear sites. Yet despite the apparent progress, deep divisions persist. While some officials suggest Israel has softened its stance, Prime Minister Netanyahu publicly vowed again on Wednesday to fundamentally eliminate Hamas, stating, "I am telling you, there will be no more Hamas. We are not going back to that." This hardline position directly clashes with Hamas's demand for a permanent end to the war as a precondition for releasing all remaining hostages, estimated at around 20 living captives and 30 bodies. The political tightrope Mr. Netanyahu walks is precarious. Moving forward with a ceasefire could risk the collapse of his far-right coalition, whose members oppose ending the war and advocate for indefinite Israeli rule in Gaza. However, analysts suggest that buoyed by what many Israelis consider a successful June war with Iran, Mr. Netanyahu might now be willing to take that risk, potentially leveraging an end to the Gaza conflict to advance Israel's diplomatic ties with neighboring Arab countries. The human cost of the conflict remains staggering, with the Gaza Health Ministry reporting over 56,000 casualties, including thousands of children. Since the war began on October 7, 2023, following Hamas's attack that killed approximately 1,200 people in Israel. This diplomatic tightrope walk occurs within a broader context of U.S. Middle East policy, which the Middle East Institute recently characterized as arriving at a temporary and fragile limbo. This assessment aligns with criticism from former Biden State Department officials who have reportedly criticized President Trump for giving up on diplomacy too soon with Iran. The confluence of these events highlights the fluid and often unpredictable nature of regional politics, where every diplomatic move is scrutinized and often met with skepticism from various corners. Adding another layer to this already complex narrative is the burgeoning phenomenon of diaper diplomacy, a term coined to describe the unsettling rise of AI-generated slop videos featuring political figures as infants. Channels like Diaper Diplomacy on YouTube Shorts have rapidly amassed significant followings, with one such account gaining over 45,000 subscribers and millions of views in just weeks. These AI-powered recreations of political debates and news moments, while seemingly innocuous or satirical, raise serious questions about the future of political communication and the potential for digital manipulation. The proliferation of such content underscores a growing challenge for media literacy, as the lines between authentic reporting, satire, and outright misinformation become increasingly blurred. This trend not only trivializes serious geopolitical issues but also risks desensitizing audiences to the gravity of global events, fundamentally altering how political narratives are consumed and understood. As the international community watches closely for any breakthrough in Gaza, and as the U.S. continues to navigate its intricate role in the region, the parallel evolution of digital media presents a critical, often overlooked dimension. The future of Middle East diplomacy will not only be shaped by traditional statecraft and military actions but also by the algorithms and viral content that increasingly define our shared informational landscape, demanding greater vigilance from consumers and content creators alike to discern truth from the manufactured narrative.